Hello, welcome to this video presentation on self-directed learning. What I'm going to be doing is explaining a little bit about what self-directed learning is all about, why it's important, and how the Avenue Professional Development Programme can contribute to promoting it. Let's start with children. As children, so much is decided for us: what we do, where we go, and importantly, what and how we learn. So there is an expectation that children will have little say in what they're going to learn or how they're going to learn it. All those decisions tend to be made by grown-ups. But as adults, we have choices. We have choices about what we learn, how we learn, and when we learn. Or do we? Because the way the conventional education system tends to work is that there are people in certain positions who will make those decisions. You will have, for example, university staff who will make decisions about what should be on the curriculum for a degree, how much time will be spent on this topic or that topic, what order the topics will be presented in, which topics will be tested through assessment, through an assignment of some description, for example, and which ones won't. In the workplace, there are training officers, training managers, workforce development and planning people who will be in a position to decide what training gets commissioned, what it covers, and so on. And then the actual trainer delivering a course will obviously have a say in terms of what's covered, how it's delivered, how long is spent on each topic, which elements are covered and which are not, and so on. So basically, the learning process to a large extent is driven by people who are paid to promote learning. And in itself, that's not a problem, because in my experience at least, most of the people involved in those jobs are well placed to do so. They have a good understanding of what learning is all about and what helps and what hinders and so on. But when you think about it, it's still a continuation of the school system, that to a certain extent it's still treating people like children. You know, if we think of good old transactional analysis in terms of adult, parent, child, that sort of thing, then there's still a strong element of parent-child there rather than adult. So a key part of self-directed learning is we make it more of an adult setup. It's about playing a more active role in terms of those three elements: what we learn, how we learn, and when we learn. Because what we have to recognise is what we need to learn will be different for different people in different circumstances. But if we go on a training course, for example, then it's pretty much the same for everybody on that course. There's limited space, and I know this as a very experienced training provider. There's very limited space for tailoring to individual needs, particularly if you've got a large group to work with. So each individual playing more of an active role in terms of deciding what is it they need to learn can be an important step forward. There are also significant issues in terms of how we learn. There are different learning styles, there are different aspects of learning that people feel more comfortable with. For example, a lot of people choose video for learning now, and in a sense it's partly what we're doing right now. But personally, although I actually provide a lot of video-based learning for other people, I don't learn a great deal from video myself. And part of the reason for that is I'm a very fast reader. So what I can hear said on, say, a 20-minute video, I could probably have read that in less than 10 minutes. And so having to wait for the information to come at a slower pace than what I'm used to is frustrating for me. But that doesn't matter for other people who may well actually benefit from the slower pace. So it's horses for courses in terms of how we learn. There isn't a standard pattern. And then there are issues about when we learn. That the idea that there is a chunk of learning in the form of a training course every now and again doesn't suit everybody. In fact, it doesn't suit many people. What can be much more effective is learning that's done in smaller chunks. So half an hour here, an hour there, and so on, can help to integrate learning with practice. Going off to a venue for a full day, being given a lot to think about, and then going back to your working environment where there may be little emphasis on learning, it's then very difficult to convert the learning, as it were, to transfer the learning from the training room into the practice base. Whereas if you are involved in self-directed learning, you can do that in whatever chunks you feel are going to help you. If you want to do it in a full day, then that's fine. It's whatever works for you. That's the flexibility of self-directed learning. Okay, so to sum up then, self-directed learning is where we move into a more adult, more flexible approach to learning, where we take ownership for our own learning. It's not up to other people to decide for us. We can still benefit from their advice and guidance, from their knowledge and their wisdom and so on, but it means we have to play a more active role. Because if you think about it, the way the system tends to work in terms of education and training is that learners are largely passive. It's the people who run the system that tend to play a more active role in this. So self-directed learning is about making a transition from being a passive learner to an active learner and taking ownership of your own learning in terms of what you learn, how you learn, and when you learn. Okay, so what does it take to be a self-directed learner? Well, I want to look at, to begin with, 3 C's, 3 important elements of what it takes to be a self-directed learner. First of all, it takes a degree of commitment. You have to take charge, you have to make decisions for yourself, you have to basically make it happen. If you are staying within the conventional passive form of learning, that passive approach, then perhaps you will be told what training courses are available, and you may be asked or directed to go on a particular training course, or you may choose to go on that training course. But most of the things are done for you. Where it happens, when it happens, how it happens, and so on. Whereas with self-directed learning, you have to make a commitment to deciding for yourself. And it's back to those 3 things: what you're going to learn, how you're going to learn, and when you're going to learn. If you don't take ownership, you don't make it happen, then that's it, it won't happen. And you're not having self-directed learning. In a sense, what you're having is self-directed non-learning. So commitment is really important. Then the second C is contribution. That if you're going to be an active learner, then you have to contribute. You have to play an active role in taking the learning forward. I've run many training courses, for example, where people have sat throughout a full day, barely said a word, barely got involved in any discussions, not asked any questions, not seeming to make any links between what we're discussing and their actual practice. At the end of the day, when they're asked to fill in an evaluation form, they'll say something like, yeah, great course, but when it comes to filling in the box saying what in particular have you learned today, then often there's just a vague comment along the lines of it's been very useful. But if they can't actually pin it down to useful in what way, then it probably wasn't very useful. So if you want to get the most out of learning, you have to contribute. And that applies these days to online learning, for example. that a lot of people like to lurk, as it's called. They will perhaps be involved in a discussion forum, and they will read what other people have to say but rarely contribute. And that means that basically their opportunity to learn is being reduced significantly. It doesn't mean they won't learn anything, but they'll learn a lot less compared with making their own comments, asking their own questions, engaging with what the issues are, so that they can hear what other people think about that. They can get a broader perspective. They can perhaps have their assumptions questioned in a very gentle and supportive way, but questioned and challenged nonetheless. So the second C is contribution. People have to contribute if they're going to get the best out of learning. That's a key part of self-directed learning. Just passively sitting there, literally or metaphorically, and letting the world go by is not self-directed learning. It's back to self-directed non-learning. And then the third C is courage. That to get out of your comfort zone of letting other people decide what's important in terms of your learning, letting other people take the lead role in terms of what direction your learning is going to go in, and so on. Making that transition can be quite scary, in the early stages at least. So it takes a certain degree of courage to say to yourself, I am not going to allow other people to be in charge of my learning from now on. I am going to take charge of it myself. This is my learning for my career, for my life. And I will use the support and guidance that's available. But at the end of the day, and even at the beginning of the day, this is my learning. I'm in charge of it. And so I will not slip back into this passive approach to learning where other people are in the driving seat. So 3 important C's there: commitment, contribution and courage. And as you can see from the graphic, what it's also about is care. You need to care about your learning. If learning doesn't matter to you, if all you want to do is get through the day, work your way through to payday and so on, you've got no real interest in learning, then self-directed learning is not for you. It's got to be for people who are actually committed to learning, committed to taking charge of their own learning experiences, their learning pathway as it's called. They've got to make the appropriate active contributions to that. They've got to have the courage to do that. That's what the 3 C's are about. Now, next I want to look at why is self-directed learning important. We've got another 3 C's to look at in terms of why self-directed learning is so important. First of all, the first C is control, that you're in control of your learning. So what that means is you can tailor it to your specific circumstances. So if you are wrestling with a particular difficulty, the chances that that's going to be covered on a training course or at a conference or in a book that you've decided to read or a research report, the chances that your specific issue will be covered are on average pretty slim. But if you decide that you're in control of your learning, then you will be more focused on addressing your specific needs. For example, if I'm running a training course with 20 people, what I have to do, in a sense, is go for the lowest common denominator. I cannot, nor can any other trainer for that matter, I cannot tailor a training course to 20 individual specific needs. So what I will tend to do is at the beginning of a training course is encourage participants to raise their own issues, ask their own questions, think about throughout the day, to be thinking about what's this got to do with me? How does this idea that we're discussing or this approach that we're exploring, how do these things actually relate to my workplace, to my challenges, my circumstances, the direction that I want to go in? So that's what control is about. This is why self-directed learning is important, because what makes self-directed learning so effective is that it's tailored to your specific learning needs, that you are in control of what you focus on. Then the second C is continuous development. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the idea of CPD, of continuous professional development. But I've always been suspicious of that term because, for one thing, for most people, it's not continuous. It tends to be spasmodic, it tends to be episodic. There are so many people, for example, who tend to see training as the basis of their learning, so that during their working day they may be just getting on with the job and learning isn't to the fore, and then every so often they take a break from doing the job and go to a place, a training venue, where they focus on learning, and then in all likelihood when they're back in that place of work find it difficult to adapt what's been discussed on the course to their circumstances. And so at best it tends to be spasmodic or episodic, the learning, and in some circumstances it may not happen at all. There's a lot being written, a lot being discussed about what's known as the transfer of learning problem. It's not unusual, for example, and I've come across this myself many times, it's not unusual for people to go on, say, a one-day training course, at the end of the day fill in an evaluation form saying, what a great day, I've learned so much, and then really struggle to take that learning with them to the workplace. I've had people tell me, for example, when they've been on a course with me one time, and then say a couple of months or a few weeks later they're on a course with me about a different topic, and I ask them about how they've been using what they gained from the previous course in their practice, and 9 times out of 10 the response to that is not very positive. That I will get vague comments like, oh yeah, it was a great course, it was really helpful, and when I press gently but firmly, yeah, but in particular, which of those ideas or approaches that we discussed, which of those have you actually been able to put into practice and actually improve your practice because of the course? And most of the time I have to give up asking because they start to get embarrassed, because that transfer of learning from the training room to actual practice is a huge problem. So the idea of self-directed learning is that it's continuous development. If you're in charge of your learning, it isn't just about going on a training course every now and again. It's about constantly learning. It's linked in with the idea of reflective practice. So it's about, as you're practicing, thinking about what are the lessons I can learn from this? What is the way I am working teaching me that can improve my practice? When you're in control, when you have that self-directed learning ethos, then continuous development becomes much more of a reality. And then the third C of why it's important is competence. Because if you're following the path I've just mentioned, you're in control of your learning, it's actual continuous development, so that you're constantly better informed, more skillful, more confident, more effective in your practice, then you're becoming more competent. Sadly, many people end up on what I call a competence plateau. Now, what I mean by that is, if you imagine a plateau as a flat mountain, is for a while they'll climb, they will improve, they will increase their knowledge, their skills, their confidence, and so on. But then they reach a certain point where that stops, where they just plateau. They will then continue on the same level, potentially for years. And given how much the practice situation, the world of practice, how it's changing, developing, new challenges emerging all the time, then the idea that you can get away with just basic competence is a dangerous one. We need to keep learning, growing, developing, improving. Self-directed learning is a really important basis for that. It can help us to be truly professional in the sense of constantly improving our practice. If we are adopting a passive approach to our learning, we're leaving our learning in the general, non-specific framework governed by other people, then we're not going to get the best return on investment in terms of our learning efforts. So these are really important issues in terms of self-directed learning being so important. But is it really that important is the next question, and a big fat yes is the answer to that. And I want to look at 4 R's this time in terms of the really intense, incredible importance of self-directed learning. The first is reflection. We've talked a lot over the years, and a lot has been written about reflective practice, and particularly critically reflective practice. But that's of little use if we adopt a passive approach to learning. If we are waiting for other people to draw out the lessons for us, we're waiting for other people to tell us what's important, what the key issues are, and so on, then we're not really entering into a proper spirit of reflective practice. Reflective practice is about thinking carefully about what we're doing, both when we're doing it and after we're doing it, and ideally also before we're doing it in terms of planning. So reflection and self-directed learning fit together nicely, whereas if we are not engaged in self-directed learning, our approach to learning is passive, then the results of our reflective practice are likely to be limited. Then the second R is recall. If we are in charge of our own learning, we're focusing on what matters to us, we are focusing in ways that help us learn best, then we're much more likely to remember what we learn. It's much more likely to stick with us if it's real to us. And that could be another R, that the reality of the learning. It's real if we can remember it. I've lost count of the number of discussions I've had with people on courses, for example, where I may mention a particular theoretical perspective or approach, and often the response will be, oh yeah, I learnt about that at university years ago and I thought that was really useful. And then of course that prompts me to ask, well, if you thought it was really useful, have you used it? And normally the response is, no, I'd forgotten about it. So learning about things in general as part of an overall process is only the beginning. What we need to do is to pin down specific learning about specific situations, and then they become real to us, they matter, and we'll be able to recall them. We will not make the mistake of forgetting about key issues from our professional knowledge base if they are alive and well in our thinking. Self-directed learning helps with that. Then the third R is re-energizing. Being in control of your learning is great for morale. It's great to boost motivation, to be in control, to feel you're in charge of your learning. For example, over the years I've done a lot of work around stress and the problems that stress brings. And one of the things I've become very aware of is that a key factor in terms of stress is control. So, for example, somebody with a huge amount of pressure bearing down on them may not get stressed if they've got control over those pressures. Whereas somebody who's got only a modest amount of pressure on them but has little or no control over those pressures can be very stressed. So control is very important in terms of keeping stress at bay. And a key part of that is that self-directed learning and the sense of control it brings can be re-energizing, can boost our motivation and play a role in terms of positive morale. And then the fourth R is resilience. We face an awful lot of problems in our lives, whether in our personal lives or our working lives, or sometimes an interaction of the two. And resilience is about, of course, bouncing back from adversity and being in charge of our learning, feeling more confident about our learning, going from strength to strength in terms of our knowledge, our skills, our values, our confidence, and so on. Having all those positives behind us can help with the resilience, can give us more strength to bounce back from adversity. So when circumstances knock us down, then self-directed learning and all the benefits it brings can play a significant part in getting us back up on our feet again. So those are the 4 R's of the importance of self-directed learning: reflection, recall, re-energizing, and resilience. What I want to do now is to look at how the Avenue Professional Development Programme can add to this, how it can play a positive role. The programme was set up in 2013, and it was set up specifically to help promote self-directed learning, because by this time I had spent literally decades either teaching students at a college or a university, running training courses, speaking at conferences, and so on. And I'm pleased to say getting very, very positive feedback about that. But I wasn't entirely convinced that this was the best way of promoting learning because of this issue about, for example, if I'm running a training course with 20 people, I cannot, nor can any other trainer, tailor it to each of the 20 specific sets of learning needs. It's down to the individual to be able to clarify what is the learning pathway, as I like to call it, that they need to follow. It's back to those 3 things. What are they needing to learn? How are they going to learn it? And when is the best time to learn it? And so I developed the Avenue Professional Development Programme as a vehicle for doing that. So what you see on screen is the main screen, the home page, as it were, with the drop-down menu being visible just to the right of centre. Now, the reason that it was done in this way was to give a focal point for self-directed learning. So what I want to do now is to just briefly go through some of the main elements of this menu to show how members of the Avenue Professional Development Programme can benefit from it. So if we go to start off with the 4th item down, an Eportfolio / reflective log. This is a reflective log facility. If people want to do that type of reflective diary, the facility is there, and linked to that is an Eportfolio, which is an opportunity for people to record and consolidate their learning. And there are at least 2 main reasons for that. For people who are professionally registered, then it is evidence of learning, that if they're asked to show evidence of learning, they can go to their Eportfolio and show where they have recorded their thoughts, where they have kept a record of what ideas they found useful, how they've put them into practice, what the results were, and so on and so forth. They can perhaps put notes from something they've read to remind themselves and to demonstrate to anybody who needs to know that they actually learned something from reading that book, that article, that research report, or whatever. So in terms of professional registration and, if you like, evidence of learning, the Eportfolio is very useful. But something that's often forgotten about Eportfolios is that what can be just as important, if not more so, is recording your learning consolidates that learning. You're much more likely to remember something if you've written it down. If you've made a note of what you found useful about that article, that book, that video you watched, whatever it was, that practice experience you had where you gained an insight from it, actually writing that down not only acts as a sort of a memory jogger in future, but also the actual act of writing it down will consolidate that learning. It makes it more likely it will stick where it needs to. Okay, and then if we go 2 steps beyond that, the coffee shop. This is a sort of an informal discussion forum where people can get to know one another, they can chat. Because if you think of this as being the equivalent of a college or a university, it's often in the coffee shop or the refectory or whatever that a lot of the learning goes on, where you might have, after a lecture, for example, one student says, "Did you understand what was meant by such and such? I was puzzled by that." And then someone else says, "Oh, well, the way I interpreted it was this." So that informal discussion is often part of the learning, but it's also part of helping people relax and feel comfortable, and that too is part of the learning as well. Then next we have seminar rooms, and these are basically discussion forums about different sets of issues. One forum, for example, is called "Can I just run something by you?" And the basic idea of that is people can bring particular situations they are struggling with, they're wrestling with, and say, "Look, I've got this situation where this is the case and I'm concerned about it, I'm not sure what to do. What do other people think?" And then other members of the group, other members of the program can then say words to the effect of, "Have you considered this?" Or, "Oh, I had a similar situation and this is what I did." So again, that is a useful part of the learning. And these seminar rooms or discussion forums are really important for that reason, that this is where so much of the learning actually takes place, is in the interaction, where people start to appreciate other people's points of view, where their own point of view gets discussed and questioned, and they perhaps start to extend that point of view or rethink it in some way, in a sensitive, supportive way, not in a way that is in any sense threatening or difficult. So the seminar rooms are really important. If you compare that with a training course, for example, then you may have a trainer who makes a presentation about X, Y, or Z, and then there's a discussion about that presentation, and that will be where the learning takes place, not so much in the presentation itself, but in exploring the ideas that the presentation has put forward. So the discussion is crucial, and that then takes me back to the 3 C's I talked about before, including contribution. That just reading what other people have had to say may be helpful up to a point, but where the real learning takes place is where you actually join in, where you contribute. You give your point of view and see what people think about that. It enables you to extend and deepen your understanding by doing that. Next is the library, and this is basically the equivalent of a physical library in the sense that it contains a lot of learning resources. So since 2013 there have been more and more resources added to that library. So there are articles, book chapters, videos, audio lessons, a whole range of things, and any one of those can be a point of learning for you, for members that is, and you can also use that to start a discussion. In fact, that's what happens from time to time. You might have somebody who will say words to the effect of, "I've just been reading the article or watching the video about X, Y, or Z, and it's made me wonder about whatever." And so that's then will start a discussion about whatever that was about. Then the study is where there are 2 significant things. One is this tells members how to get access to the Learning to Learn course that is part of the program. And what this is about is that the conventional education and training world seems to take it for granted that people know how to learn, that they will just naturally learn and learn effectively. And my experience over the decades has taught me that that's not the case, that there are some people who actually struggle with learning, and it doesn't do anybody any harm to actually look at what are the basic principles of learning and to then build on them. So that's part of the study, is access to that Learning to Learn course. What's also in the study is a workbook called the Foundations Workbook. We recommend that you print that out and fill it in. So it explains a lot about self-directed learning. It goes into more detail than I've been able to in this video. And then there is a section at the end, there's an appendix at the end that helps you to map out your learning pathway. Under 12 different headings, it asks you questions about what you think you need to learn and what's the best way of you learning about it. And ideally this should be done with the help of a mentor, with your supervisor, a colleague or whoever. And so those are the two elements in the study, the Learning to Learn course and the Foundations Workbook. There's also a further workbook that can be used to review your completion of the initial workbook. So if you complete the Foundations workbook at one point, then perhaps 3 to 6 months later, you can then print out a copy of the review workbook to review what progress you've made towards achieving those learning goals that you identified. The classroom is where a new resource is added each month, normally on the first of each month, and then that triggers a discussion. People are invited to look at that resource and to then give their point of view. So every month, regular as clockwork, there is a fresh resource with new ideas and more for people to consider. So that's just a quick run through of the different elements, or the main elements as well. There are some others that we haven't had time to look at. That gives you an overview of how the Avenue Professional Development Program contributes to self-directed learning. So this is what the member homepage looks like, and as you can see, it's fairly easy and straightforward to use. Once people access the menu, they can then just go to whichever section they want to, and it takes a little while to get used to it, as with any new software people are used to, but once you go through that initial learning program, it's fairly straightforward. But the reason I put this up is I just want to draw your attention to the things at the bottom in orange that weren't in the drop down menu. What is included in the program is a news feed. So there is constant updating of information from various relevant sources. There is a Twitter feed, so again tweets from various people are appearing there, and there's also access to a range of blogs that are available for people to look at. So there's always something new on the site. It's constantly being updated and refreshed. There's always something to look at to help you with your learning. Now, before I start to draw this to a close, I just want to say a few words about making the transition to self-directed learning. And the first thing I want to emphasize is you are not alone. Quite a few people have said to me over the years when I've talked about the value of self-directed learning, but it's so lonely, it's just you on your own. And I've had to question this and say, where'd you get that idea from? Where have you read or seen something that tells you that self-directed learning is somehow a lonely pursuit? Because if you're undertaking self-directed learning, it doesn't stop you using other opportunities for learning. It doesn't ban you from going on a training course or attending a conference. So, as you can see from the graphic on the right, members of the AMNU Professional Development Programme have access to fellow members. There's constant discussions, constant interactions that mean you're not alone. If you're in charge of your own learning, you can learn from your colleagues as well. You don't have to sit back and wait for the next training course. You can try and draw out the learning from your day-to-day experiences, from your line manager, from your colleagues, from anyone, from students on placement, for example, anyone where there's that opportunity. And then, of course, there are the learning facilitators. There are the training officers, the workforce development managers, the tutors, the practice educators, and so on and so forth. They're still there, that they're still able to give you advice and guidance and support and help you learn. The difference is with self-directed learning is that they are there to advise and guide you, not to take charge. They are not in charge of your learning, and it was never intended that they should be. It's not about them wanting to take charge of your learning. It's just become the default setting, as it were, in this situation. So if you are under the impression that somehow self-directed learning is lonely, then please think again. You are not alone. So making the transition, we've had C's and R's, we're on to 3 D's now. And those 3 Ds in terms of making the transition are decide, develop a routine, and do it. So let's think about each of these in a little more detail. Decide. First of all, you have to make an active decision to make the transition to self-directed learning. It won't just happen. The default setting, as I mentioned a moment ago, is the passive approach where other people are in charge of your learning. That's the way the system works. That's the way the system will continue to work, potentially to your detriment, unless you make the clear, firm decision to take charge of your own learning, to take ownership for your learning, and to start thinking actively, what is it I need to learn? What's the best way of me learning it, and what's the best time for me to learn it? And whether or not that's through the AMNU Professional Development Programme or some other means, that's basically the bedrock, if you like, the basis of self-directed learning, is making that decision, empowering yourself to make that decision to take charge of your learning. Then secondly, what you need to do is to develop a routine. It's very easy to slip back into a passive approach to learning. For example, I've had discussions with members of the AMNU Professional Development Programme who have been very active for a while, and then we don't see them, and then they eventually come back and rejoin and say words to the effect of, "Oh, I've missed being involved." So it's slipping back into the old habits is basically a very easy thing to do. So what I recommend is that anybody who wants to take up self-directed learning is develop a routine. So it's very useful, for example, for members of the program to set a particular time, that they are going to log in every Monday afternoon and every Friday morning, or whatever suits them. Just to get a routine, because basically if you don't have a routine, there's a very real danger that you'll lose the grip on your own learning and slip back into either learning not happening or happening because somebody else is in control of it. And then the third D is do it, make it happen. This is at the very heart of it. Making the transition means you are in control of your learning, so take control, make the decision, develop the routine, and do it. Make self-directed learning a reality for yourself. So that's pretty much it. That's what I wanted to get across in this presentation. Hope you found it useful. It's basically about recognizing the value of self-directed learning, but also recognizing that it won't happen by magic. You have to make it happen. And if the Avenue Professional Development Programme can help you with that, then that's great. So thank you for listening. Cheers. Bye.